I was thinking the other day that the First World War, which was 102 years ago, and I was thinking that when I was a child, it was a part of my early childhood because of the fact that I suppose when I was born in 1931, it was only 11 or 12 years since it had happened. And so people used to talk about it. Now, what I have thought about since is they never talked about the really bad things. They mainly talked about how they got through and if they had fun and people they knew and the politics of it, but they didn't actually talk about the horrors of it until they got older. And then when there was a series on the television many years ago now, talking about the First World War, people opened up. And one of them was Lloyd's father. And Lloyd said he'd never spoken about the war. But I just said to him, well, I've been watching that series. Have you been watching it? You know, because I know you were in it. And I remember distinctly we were walking up through Bournemouth to get the newspaper. And he just opened up about a lot of it. Not horrible things, but things that happened to him. For instance, once he was in a dugout with several of his friends, because they used to go in those days, when people joined up, they had what they called the PALS units. And so they would go in with a lot of people of their own village or town, you see. And when the Second World War came on, I think they stopped that because there were so many casualties in the little villages. And anyway, he went with his friends and they were sat in this dugout, and there were his friends and some other men, and they were all sat around in a circle in this dugout thing. And there was a huge cannon, I suppose it was, fired. And for some reason, he thought, I'll go over to the other side. And he just walked across the dugout. And the next thing, this thing hit, and the blast and everything, it killed them. And he was there, all right. And he couldn't believe it. I think it was the blast that killed them. And he never knew why he suddenly thought, I'll just go over and sit on the other side. And the other thing that happened to him, being fortunate, was that he was trained to be an instructor in some kind of a new gun. I think it was a Lewis gun. And he was going to be an instructor. And he was on the train, ready to go. And they all knew they were going up to Ypres, which was a dreadful battleground. And they'd had other battles there before. And they were going up there. And he was on the train and just settling in. And someone came up the platform, one of the officers, saying, Truex, come out, because you're wanted out here. And when he went out, his instructor's ticket had come through. And so he walked down past all the others on the train who were leaning out of the windows. And I said to him, well, you hear about people being heroic and want to go into battle, you see. And he said, well, I never met anybody who did. He said they were all leaning out of the windows and shouting, you lucky so-and-so, as I went down. And he said, they didn't say, oh, well, it's a pity you're not going into battle. So that was his experience. And his other thing was, I knew before he started talking about it, he had this absolute horror of rats. And he used to say, well, that's because of the war. Well, he told me that day about the rats. And he said there was an old song that they used to sing about the quartermaster's stores. There were rats, big as blooming cats. And I said to him, you used to sing that in joke. He said, well, you had to make a joke of it all. But actually, he said the rats were absolutely enormous because they were bloated with blood. Because there was so much blood around that they were thriving, you see, and they were huge. So he could never stand the sight of a rat. And the other thing that they suffered from, I've heard my Granny Terence say, was lice. And they had these lice, I think they used to run a lighted match over their skin to, like, you know, quickly, just to burn them off, because I think lice attach to you. And when they came home on leave, she used to say that anyone coming home on leave, the women of the house would have tin baths and bowls all full of water, very hot water, and carbolic soap, and all their clothes this is before they came into the house coming home on leave, and they'd have all their stuff sort of taken off them and put into carbolic, and then they would have to bath and clean until they were fit to come into the house. And on the topic of that, my granny used to say that one of her third youngest son, I think, towards the end of the war, he was a big boy for his age. And so he went unknowing to her, because I think at the end of the war, they were taking anybody. And he went and joined up because he wanted to be a bugle boy. He was still at the age thinking that it was glamorous. And he went, and I'm not quite sure whether he actually was a bugle boy or not, but that's how it was. He just came home, and she was absolutely horrified, I expect, because she was a widow by then. But anyway, they took him and he went. And the other thing was that in that family, my father had a horse because he had a little greengrocer, or he used to work for someone who was a greengrocer. And any horse that wasn't really, really essential to someone's business was sold for the war, because apparently there were more horses killed than anyone could believe now, because they were the main source of transport. So that was another thing. There were no horses. And I've heard Auntie Olive say that there was a very, very poor system of rationing. And so if anything came into the shops, she was in a bit of a privileged position because she was a tailoress, or an apprentice to a tailoress, and the boss would say, "Oh, all right, you can all stop and go up to the shop and queue up." And there would just be a queue, and when it ran out, those at the back didn't get anything. And the other thing they used to be allowed time off work for, to go and look at, which was a horrible thing to do, but they all did, was the casualty lists. And they were put up, I think she said it was in the post office outside. And that is the only notification some people, that was the first notification that people had of their loved ones being killed, or friends, or anyone. And she said people used to go up and they'd say, all the casualty lists are up, and everyone would go up and look at them. I mean, it sounds awful, but, well, it must have been dreadful, because you never knew what name you were going to see. And the other thing is that I don't think they were recognizing what they used to call shell shock. They just said, oh, they're shell shocked. And I think that was because of all the intense bombardment. People used to go, well, virtually, I suppose now you'd call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, when I was a little girl, all the people in the streets around where I lived, the gardens were meticulous, except for this one old man, and his garden was full of trenches. And he would like dig these trenches, and like angular trenches all over the garden. And sometimes he wouldn't dig for weeks. And I used to have to pass this place to go up to my granny's house. And then you'd go out and he'd be digging. And then he would dig for several days, you see. And I said to my grandpa, why does Mr. Fowler keep digging his garden and he doesn't grow anything? And he just said, and I didn't find out for years what he meant, he just said, oh, he's shell-shocked. So that family lived with that for the rest of that man's life. I think he was still doing it when he became elderly. He would just feel impelled to go out and dig trenches. I mean, no one sort of said, oh, poor Mr. Fowler or anything. They just said, oh, Mr. Fowler's digging again, as if it was not a very unusual thing to do. We can't really think about it now. And the other thing was that those who did come back, they used to be quite pleased to use their little phrases and things that they picked up, because obviously they couldn't speak French. And like if they were going to bed, they'd say, oh, allez couche. If they were sending children to bed, they'd say, come on, allez couche, which obviously they'd heard in France, you see. And the other thing was they used to, no, it was allez couche, and I can't remember the other, but another one was the word, and it's fuchi. And all the people I know say fuchi. It's someone who, they don't attack a job, they just mess about, and you think, oh, when are they actually going to attack what they're doing? And they say, oh, they're fuchi. Well, years and years ago, there used to be a television program called Call My Bluff. And they'd put up this word and people would have to guess what they thought it meant, you see. And it turned out that fuchi is a German word for that kind of thing. So they must have brought that word back with them, fuchi. And the other thing is that when I was on holiday one year, I met an old man, a very nice old man. Obviously, he was an army officer. You could tell that by his demeanor. And he said he was he was an army officer. And then his friend said to me, his friend whispered in an aside to me, and he won the VC. So I said to him about the war, because this was when those programs were on. Everyone was talking about it. And he said to me, the one thing that he hated was coming home on leave. He said, because in London, because apparently Lloyd told me after, a good officer is very attached to his men. And he used to come home to London, and obviously being an officer, he would have quite privileged treatment. And he said people had shows going on, and these women were singing and encouraging men to join up, and sort of like treating people who hadn't joined up as if they were traitors. And he said he used to be glad to get back to France because he used to feel so disloyal to his men watching these people on the stage. And as he said, they had no idea of the horrors that they were actually talking about so lightly. And that's another memory I've got of it. And then my Uncle Percy, who I later found out in life had won the military medal. Now he won this because he was a medic in the medical corps, I think. Well, anyway, he was going out as a stretcher bearer, and also I always remember all my life that if anybody had anything wrong with him, he would bandage them up, and he usually could diagnose it. And he was a person you turned to because of this. Well, he won the military medal, and his granddaughter Peggy found out why he won it, and it was because he went out into what they used to call no man's land, because after the fighting, all the people would be there laying, waiting for either rescue or burial. And he went out, and there were these huge shell holes which were full of water, because when it rained, and it was a clay soil, I think, and so they would get full of water, and they slipped in the mud carrying the stretcher with this man on it who was badly injured, and they slipped over and the man fell into the shell hole. Well, it was unheard of for anyone to go in there. It was almost certain death to go in, and he jumped in, and with the help of other people pulling, he somehow managed to rescue this man and got him out of the shell hole. and so he had the military medal for that. Well, after the First World War, and all through my childhood, up until they still had it in the World War II, but they used to have a commemoration of the Armistice Day and the Peace Day. And there's the huge parades in those days of all the ex-servicemen wearing their medals and bands playing like those processions are. And the family used to say to him, "Percy, you ought to go." I didn't know he'd won a medal, but I know they used to say, "Percy, you ought to go," of all people. And he would never go to the Armistice Day parade. He said, "No, I don't want to go. I see them every day. They're up in front of me. I don't need to go to remember them. They're up in front." So that was the only thing I can remember that showed what, but I didn't realize the implications of that then when he used to say it. But I do remember when the Second World War began, he was very, very against the war, and so was my grandfather, because they just said, well, those that want the war, let them go out and fight it, you see, because they'd only recently, if you think about it, come home 20 years ago, and someone who went in it would only be in their 30s in the Second World War, probably, wouldn't they? So he went to all lengths to keep his son out of it, because he was the foreman in the moulding shop in the munitions factory, and if a person was in a reserved occupation, which meant they were essential to the factory, they weren't called up. And he did that until his son rebelled against it and said, "Look, I'm not going to be the only one there that isn't going." I think the other men were thinking, well, why isn't he gone? Because and of all things, he went in to be the same thing as his father did, which I don't know what his father thought of that, but that's exactly what he did. He went and did what his father did: stretcher bearing and nursing. The other thing that I remember, just before I finish, is the songs of the First World War. And the men used to sing all these very cheerful songs, like they do in every war. People make up cheerful songs just to lift their morale, I suppose. And I grew up singing, and Sharon remembers some, and I think probably Alison does too, of things like "Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag." And, well, people sort of know the tunes now, and it's "Long Way to Tipperary." And the other one that I remember they all used to sing was, and quite proudly because it was French, "Mademoiselle from Armentières." Now, I think probably they had some rather risque words to it. We used to sing "Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous," you see. I don't know who she was. She was probably some lady of the town. And everyone used to do that. And they used to take children on their knee and bounce them up and down, singing "Mademoiselle from Armentières," because it had quite a catchy tune. So that's one thing I remember, is all the tunes. Right, that's it now.